Growing up in the Calloway household, there was an unspoken rule that everyone understood but no one ever said out loud. My brother came first. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been hurt so badly that you needed stitches, and the person who hurt you walked away laughing while your own parents handed him a glass of lemonade? Leave me a comment below, because what I'm about to tell you still doesn't feel real even now. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, I'm a licensed occupational therapist, and for most of my adult life, I genuinely believed that the things that happened to me in my own family were my fault, that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. It took a security camera, a fractured wrist, and a very calm detective sitting across from my mother at a kitchen table to finally prove otherwise. My brother's name is Derek. He's 3 years older than me, and from the moment I was old enough to understand dynamics, I understood that he was the son our entire family orbited around. Derek had been a standout baseball player since Little League. By the time he was in high school, my father had already built an entire identity around being Derek's dad. He coached Derek's travel team, wore Derek's jersey number on his own cap, and kept a laminated newspaper clipping of Derek's sophomore season stats in his wallet. I know because I saw it once when he opened his wallet to pay for dinner. He didn't have a photo of me in there. Not one. My mother was softer about it, or at least she pretended to be. She would occasionally remember my birthday without being reminded, sometimes ask about my work in a way that sounded genuinely curious. But when Derek was in the room, the air changed. Her posture changed. Her attention snapped toward him like a compass finding north, and I became background noise. I got very good at being background noise. The jokes started when I was around 9 or 10. That's what my family called them. Jokes. Derek had a particular style of humor that always, without exception, required someone else to be the punchline. And that someone was almost always me. He would flick food at me during dinner and laugh when I flinched. He would grab my homework off the counter and hold it over his head, making me jump for it while my parents watched and smiled like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. When I got upset, when my eyes filled up and my throat tightened, the energy in the room would shift against me. "Oh, come on, Claire. He's just playing. You're so sensitive. He didn't mean anything by it." "Derek, say sorry. Claire, stop making it a big deal." That was the template. Derek would apologize in the flattest possible tone, the kind of apology that was more of a performance for our parents than any real acknowledgement, and then we'd all move on. I learned to move on very quickly. I learned that my feelings were an inconvenience, that expressing them out loud would only result in being labeled dramatic, and that the fastest way to make the discomfort stop was to smile and say I was fine. I carried that pattern well into adulthood. I moved to Cincinnati for college, graduated, built a career, made friends who actually listened when I talked. I started therapy at 24 with a woman named Dr. Holloway, and it was in her office that I first said out loud, slowly and with a lot of pauses, that I wasn't sure the way I grew up was entirely normal. She didn't react with shock. She just nodded and said, "Tell me more." That was the beginning of a very long unraveling. Even while I was in therapy, even while I was starting to understand the dynamics that had shaped me, I still went home for the holidays. I still answered my mother's calls. I still showed up, partly because I loved my parents in that complicated, grief-tinged way that children of difficult families often do, and partly because every time I considered pulling back, I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me I was being dramatic. That voice had been living rent-free in my head for 20 years. The summer I turned 30, my parents announced they were renting a house on Lake Erie for a long weekend to celebrate my father's 65th birthday. Derek would be there with his girlfriend, Amber. My parents would be there, and they wanted me there too. I said yes because saying no felt like a war I didn't have the energy to fight. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The house was a beautiful old lake property with a wide wraparound porch, a wooden dock that extended out over the water, and a kitchen that smelled like my mother's potato salad. For about 45 minutes, things were fine. My father was in a genuinely good mood. My mother had made all the food I liked. Amber was friendly and easy to talk to, and Derek was Derek. He was louder than everyone else and funnier than everyone else. and he had a new story about his softball league that he told 3 times in 2 hours, each time with slightly more dramatic detail. I told myself I could do this. 3 days. I could do 3 days. The first incident happened Saturday morning. I was out on the dock with a cup of coffee, just sitting, watching the water. Derek came out and made some comment about my hair. I'd cut it shorter that year, and he'd already said twice the night before that he didn't like it. He said it again on the dock. I told him I liked it, which was true, and turned back toward the water. That was apparently the wrong response. He grabbed the back of my coffee mug, not hard enough to spill it, but hard enough to jostle it against my hand, and said, "Relax, I'm just messing with you." I said nothing. He stood there for another few seconds, seemed almost annoyed by my lack of reaction, and then went back inside. I sat with my coffee and told myself to let it go. I was already counting down the hours. Saturday afternoon, most of us were in and out of the lake. The dock was wet. My mother had set up some chairs at the end of it. I was walking toward those chairs when Derek, who had been standing just behind me on the dock, put both hands on my shoulders and shoved me. Not a nudge. Not a bump. He put his hands flat on my back and pushed, the way you would push a door that was stuck. I went sideways off the dock. The fall was only about 4 feet into the water, which sounds minor until I tell you that the dock had a wooden ladder on the side and I hit my arm against it on the way down. When I surfaced, gasping, the pain in my left wrist was immediate and sharp. Derek was laughing. Amber looked alarmed. My mother, who had seen the whole thing from her chair, called out, "Oh, Claire, are you okay?" in the same tone she might use if I'd stubbed my toe. I climbed back onto the dock. My wrist was throbbing. I held it against my body and said I thought I needed to go to urgent care. My father, who had been watching from the shore, walked over and looked at my wrist for approximately 3 seconds. "It's probably just a sprain," he said. "Put some ice on it." Derek said, "I didn't even push her that hard." My mother said, "Claire, don't make this into a whole thing, please. It's your father's birthday weekend." I stood there dripping on the dock with my wrist pulsing and my family looking at me with varying degrees of irritation, and I heard myself say, "Okay, I'll ice it." Because that was the voice in my head. Because I had been trained since childhood to shrink. Because 30 years of conditioning doesn't disappear just because you've been in therapy for 6 years. I went inside and sat with an ice pack wrapped around my wrist for the rest of the afternoon. By dinner it was swollen and bruised. My mother glanced at it twice and said nothing. Derek made a joke at dinner about people who can't take a swim, and my father laughed. Amber didn't laugh. She caught my eye across the table and gave me a small, tight look that said she saw it, even if she didn't say anything. I barely slept that night. The wrist pain was bad enough that I couldn't find a comfortable position. By Sunday morning, the bruising had spread and 2 of my fingers were numb. I came downstairs and told my mother I needed to go to urgent care. She sighed. She actually sighed. "Can it wait until we get home tomorrow?" "My fingers are numb," I said. She said she'd tell my father. My father said I was probably being anxious about it. He said he'd looked it up, and that finger numbness after a sprain was common. He had looked up my symptoms on his phone and was now diagnosing me at a kitchen counter in a lake house, and he said it with the full confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything in his own mind. I drove myself to urgent care. I didn't ask permission or announce it. I picked up my keys from the hook by the door and I left. Behind me, I heard my mother say something to my father in a low voice, but I didn't turn around. The doctor at urgent care was a young woman, maybe a few years older than me, with efficient hands and a very calm face. She looked at my wrist, looked at the bruising, looked at the numbness in my fingers, and she ordered an X-ray. The X-ray showed a fracture in my distal radius. She said given the swelling in the presentation, she wanted me to follow up for an MRI to rule out additional soft tissue damage, particularly around the ligaments. She asked how I'd injured it. I told her I'd been pushed off a dock by my brother and hit my arm on the ladder. She typed something into her computer and then looked at me for a moment. "Was this intentional?" she asked. I said I didn't know, which was not entirely honest. She gave me a splint, a referral, and a pamphlet about next steps. She also, quietly, before I left, said that if I ever felt unsafe, there were resources available. I thanked her and walked back to my car and sat in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. When I got back to the lake house and told my family it was fractured, there was a brief silence. Derek said, "Seriously?" in a tone that suggested this was deeply inconvenient for him. My father said, "Well, you'll be fine. They can do a lot for fractures these days." My mother asked if I wanted her to rewrap the splint. Nobody said they were sorry, not once. I drove home that evening rather than staying for the last night. I told my parents I needed to get back for work in the morning, which was partially true. My mother walked me to my car and said she hoped I felt better. And then she said, very quietly, as I was putting my bag in the trunk, "Try not to make this into something it isn't, Claire. Your brother didn't mean to hurt you." I looked at her. I thought about 30 years of variations on that exact sentence, and I said, "Okay, Mom," got in my car, and drove 3 hours back to Cincinnati without the radio on. I followed up with an orthopedic specialist that week. The MRI confirmed a fracture and a torn ligament in my wrist, a TFCC tear, the kind that often requires surgical intervention and months of physical therapy. My doctor said the injury was consistent with significant impact force, not a minor bump. He said someone had shoved me hard. I made an appointment with Dr. Holloway the same day. I sat in her office and described everything that had happened, and somewhere around the part where my father diagnosed me with a kitchen counter search, I started crying in a way I hadn't cried in a long time. Not sad crying. Angry crying. The kind that comes from the part of you that has been quiet for too long. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't going to pretend this was fine. The MRI report and the orthopedic notes went into a file. I called my insurance company, who informed me that, given the documentation, this qualified as injury from an assault and I should consider filing a police report if I wanted to pursue any kind of liability coverage for the surgery. I had not thought about it in those terms. Assault. I turned the word over in my mind. I called Amber. This was a decision I made carefully and deliberately. I had no idea where her loyalties would land, but I remembered that look across the dinner table, and I decided it was worth the risk. She picked up on the second ring. She had already been thinking about calling me. She told me that when I had driven away Sunday morning, she had gotten into an argument with Derek. She told me that Derek had laughed about it. She told me that the lake house had a security camera mounted at the corner of the porch. The owners had installed it for liability purposes, and that it faced the dock. She had noticed it on Friday when they arrived. She didn't know if it would have captured the angle, but she thought I should know it was there. I called the property management company on a Thursday afternoon. I explained that I had been injured on the dock during my stay, and I was following up with my insurance. I asked about the security camera. The woman I spoke to said that, yes, the camera was operational and they retained footage for 30 days. When I explained I had a documented fracture and an ongoing insurance claim, she said she would speak to their legal department. 2 weeks later, I had a copy of that footage. It was 12 seconds long. It showed Derek walking up behind me on the dock, placing both hands flat on my back and pushing. There was nothing ambiguous about it. There was no playfulness in the motion. His body language was deliberate. You could see me hit the ladder. You could see me surface and hold my arm. You could see Derek laughing. I took that footage, the MRI report, the orthopedic notes, and the urgent care report to the police. The detective I spoke to was a methodical, unhurried man who asked me clear questions and wrote down everything I said. He watched the footage twice. He said, "Has your brother done anything like this before?" And I told him, not everything, not 30 years of everything, but enough. The pattern. The escalation. The way it was always framed as a joke. He nodded slowly. He said, "We're going to need to talk to your family." My parents found out about the police report when a detective called my father's cell phone on a Tuesday morning. I know this because my mother called me 11 minutes later and her voice was a tone I had never heard from her before. Not angry exactly. Something more complicated than angry. Something that sounded beneath all the words she was saying like fear. She said I was destroying the family. She said Derek had made a mistake and I was turning it into a criminal matter. She said I was choosing strangers. That was the word she used, strangers, over my own blood. I let her finish, and then I said, "Mom, I have a fractured wrist, a torn ligament, a surgery scheduled for next month, and 12 seconds of video showing exactly what happened. I didn't choose strangers, I chose myself. She was quiet for a long moment. Derek was charged with misdemeanor assault. Given his clean record, his attorney pushed for a plea that resulted in probation, mandatory anger management, and restitution for my medical bills. There was no jail time, which I knew going in with the likely outcome. I won't pretend I wasn't disappointed by that, but what happened next mattered more to me than the charge. My father called me 2 weeks after the plea was entered. He didn't open with an apology. He opened by saying that this had been very hard on the family. I waited. He kept talking, slowly, like a man who had been rehearsing something and kept losing his place. He said that looking back, he thought maybe he and my mother had let things go on too long. He said he hadn't really understood how serious things had gotten. He said, in a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard from him, that he was sorry he hadn't taken me to urgent care himself. It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything. But it was the first time my father had ever admitted, out loud, that he had failed me. I held the phone and listened, and I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't fine. I said, "I hear you, Dad. I'm going to need some time." My mother took longer. She's still taking longer. We speak occasionally, short calls, careful ground. She has not fully acknowledged what happened, but she has stopped telling me I was dramatic. That might sound like a small thing. After 30 years, it doesn't feel small. Derek and I have not spoken since the plea. I don't know if we ever will. I spent a long time believing that family meant you had to keep trying, keep forgiving, keep showing up. I've come to understand that it doesn't mean that. Some people can hurt you for decades and call it love, and you can love them back and still walk away. Those two things can both be true at the same time. The surgery on my wrist was in October. It went well. Physical therapy took 4 months. I have most of my range of motion back, though my orthopedist says I'll probably always notice it in cold weather. What I notice more is the absence of a particular weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. The weight of shrinking. Of making myself smaller and quieter, so that someone else could be larger and louder. Of hearing "you're too sensitive" so many times that I started to believe my own senses were unreliable. 12 seconds of footage gave me back something that 30 years of being told I was dramatic had slowly taken away, the simple foundational certainty that what I experienced was real, that I was not imagining it, that I was not too much, that when I said I was hurt, I was hurt. I'm still in therapy with Dr. Holloway. I started journaling in a way I never did before. Not to process, exactly, but to document, to create a record of my own reality, written down in my own hand, that exists outside of anyone else's interpretation of it. I'm telling this story because I know there are people listening who have been told their whole lives that they're the dramatic one, the sensitive one, the one who always makes things bigger than they need to be. I want you to know that the problem with gaslighting is that it works. It works because it comes from people who are supposed to love you, and love makes you want to believe the most generous version of what they're saying. You tell yourself they know you better than anyone. You tell yourself maybe they're right. They're not always right. Your pain is real. Your instincts are real. And you don't need a security camera or an MRI or a detective's notepad to make that true. But if you ever get one, use it. I did. And I'm still here.